Aubrey Hooks is the Special Coordinator for the African Crisis Response Initiative. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of the Congo from 1996 to 1999. He served concurrently as Charge d'Affaires in the Central African Republic. Immediately prior to his service as ambassador, he attended the State Department's year-long senior seminar. Ambassador Hooks joined the Foreign Service in 1971. He served as a junior officer trainee at the embassy in Tel Aviv, Israel from 71 to 73. Subsequent to Polish language training, he served as consular officer in Warsaw, Poland. From 76 to 78, he worked in the Department of State as a cultural affairs officer with responsibility for cultural and educational exchanges with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Following training in economics, he was assigned as economic officer in Ankara, Turkey, from 79 to 83. After a year of university training in economics, Ambassador Hooks headed the economics section in the embassy of Port-au-Prince in Haiti. He was then given Hebrew language training. I don't know how many languages you speak. You know, we're going to have to get into this matter far more than I do. That's for sure. For those of you who anticipate careers in the Foreign Service, you'd better be prepared for a lot of foreign language training. But we're well prepared generally in that respect. He, after this Hebrew language training, was assigned again to the embassy in Tel Aviv. He attended the NATO Defense College in Rome, 91 to 92. In 1992, he was a member of the U.S. delegation to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which took place in Helsinki, Finland. From 92 to 95, Ambassador Hooks was the economic counselor in the embassy in Warsaw, Poland. On a personal note, Ambassador Hooks was born in Mullins, South Carolina on May 18th in 48. He obtained an Associate of Arts degree from Brevard College in 68 and a BA degree from the University of South Carolina in 70. He subsequently studied at George Washington University. He obtained an MA degree in economics from the University of Michigan in 1984. Ambassador Hooks is married to the former Jane Wilkinson. Hooks have 3 sons and 3 daughters and currently reside in Woodbridge, Virginia. Ambassador Hooks, we welcome you to the Kennedy Center and to BYU.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. Let me say that I'm happy to be here today. I've always wanted to come to BYU. The only way I could find to do so was to come and give a presentation. I was allowed to attend church at BYU Jerusalem for 3 years at the center there, and that was also fantastic, but never had a chance to actually attend school at BYU. So it's a pleasure to be here today and have a chance to talk to you. What I would like to do, if it's acceptable to you, is to make some general comments about Africa, particularly focusing on security, and then open up for questions, either about the subject of Africa itself, about foreign policy, or about the Foreign Service. In my view, security is the framework around which other policy has to be built. You have to have the framework there within which you can put other objectives and goals of our foreign policy, such as, for instance, democracy, good governance, economic development, human rights, environmental protection, and other issues. Because if you don't have the security and the stability, you find that you have regression rather than progression in the direction that you're looking for. Now, as I was coming into Salt Lake and I was looking at the Wasatch Range, it was a visual reminder to me that we're a long way from today's subject, which is Africa. And the question I frequently ask is why Africa? And I'm asked that question as well. What difference can it make to most of us in this room what happens or doesn't happen in Africa? Some of the difference can be measured by reasons you will recognize as part of the American character. We care about and want to stop suffering, whether caused by floods or droughts, both common in Africa, or by deadly conflict between countries, or as a result of civil war, unfortunately also too common in Africa. But a number of reasons may be somewhat more everyday and close at hand matters for most Americans than Mozambican floods or brutal civil war in Sierra Leone. Let's take the car you drive, for example. Today, Africa is the source of over 14% of our nation's oil supply. Within a decade, oil imports from Africa are projected to surpass those from the Middle East. Your car's catalytic converter, meant to keep Utah's skies a bright blue, although I noticed a haze yesterday when I was driving to Salt Lake, is lined with platinum group metals that most likely were mined in southern Africa. Similarly, the airplane I flew on to join you features other critical materials such as cobalt and manganese derived from African mineral deposits. Even the chewing gum that some of you may like to have relies upon imports of African gum Arabic, which interestingly figures in our relations with Sudan, which is the major supplier of gum Arabic. And now one of the major hot new items, of course, is coltan, which is used in the production of computers. And 80% of the supply of coltan is in Africa, and 80% of that supply is in Zaire, Congo, Kinshasa. Indeed, America's commercial interests in Africa are more significant than many people understand. Our exports to Africa, for instance, now exceed by 1/3 our exports to all the former Soviet Union combined. Both economic growth on the continent, while checkered, nevertheless, has averaged about 5%, which is especially heartening when we measure it against the 2% growth rate at the beginning of the last decade. And a number of countries are recording double-digit growth rates as they move from command economies to more rational practices of freer trade and investment-friendly economic and financial reforms. In the areas of democratic governance and law-based electoral conditions, the citizens of over half of sub-Saharan nations are now choosing their own governments and are holding their leaders accountable. The number of democracies in Africa has more than quadrupled in the last decade. Americans take pride in our transitions from one elected government to another, even while the percentage of eligible voters remains unfortunately disturbingly small. An increasing number of African states mirror our experience in routine elections preceding routine transitions, the case being in South Africa and in Botswana. And perhaps even more remarkable, in several important states such as Senegal and Ghana have recently gone through a situation where the party in power was defeated in elections, and the outgoing government accepted that. They were without bloodshed, with no rifles, no trumped-up jail time, and not even any hanging chance, dimpled or otherwise. Regional organizations such as the Organization of African Unity and the Economic Community of West African States, better known as ECOWAS, are intensifying their efforts to prevent and resolve conflicts. Others, such as the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and the revitalized East African Community, the EAC, are moving toward the establishment of regional common markets that can become economic engines in the future for growth. From the resurgence of war-torn Mozambique to the demise of apartheid in South Africa, from the budding democracies in Mali, Benin, Malawi, and Namibia, to a fresh start for the remarkable people of Nigeria, there's reason to applaud the African experience. And yet, clearly progress in Africa is neither linear nor universal. In recent months, we have witnessed significant setbacks in several regions. Some countries, which were beginning to recover from earlier conflicts, have picked up weapons again. Some societies which were building are tearing down. And some governments, which have taken steps toward democracy and reconciliation, are drifting back toward repression. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I've spent considerable time and hope to spend more in the future, and Sierra Leone are host to protracted conflicts that combine a civil war with significant participation by neighboring states. 17 years of conflict between the government of Sudan and its own southern citizens, interspersed with cycles of violence and cycles of drought, have brought perhaps as many as 3 million deaths to Africa's largest country. One of the richest countries, Angola, continues to fester with a lingering civil war that's been going on for about 25 years. Somalia, a current-day synonym for failed states in the minds of Africans and Americans alike, remains knotted in clan civil war. Like a cancer, each one of these conflicts brings a corrosive condition to the surrounding states. Refugees, and every time there's conflict, there are always refugees, and they flood across the borders. Business opportunities shrink, respect for human rights, good governance, fair and free elections, and sustainable development recede or disappear in the face of protracted and violent conflict. With their roots in Africa, these conflicts must be, in the final analysis, resolved by Africans. African leaders and African people will determine whether they are able to achieve their vast potential or fall prey to the failure of the past. And yet, the United States has its own moral, political, and economic interest in the outcome, and acting on these interests, the United States can and must play a constructive role in the region. One of the critical areas where the U.S. plays an important role is responding to instability through conflict containment, enhancement of peacekeeping capacity, and assistance to African efforts to establish competent security structures. The African Crisis Response Initiative, which is the program that I run, encourages regional peacekeeping operations where African countries and sub-regional organizations take primary responsibility. The greater regional stability created by enhanced African peacekeeping capacity also serves U.S. interests in promoting African democratic governance, respect for human rights, and economic growth. This U.S. initiative to train and equip troops from selected African militaries enables quick and effective response to peacekeeping and humanitarian relief crises throughout the continent. ACRI's comprehensive approach provides partner military contingents at battalion and brigade staff levels. A battalion is somewhere between 600 to 800 men. A brigade will be constituted of from 3 to 7 or 8 battalions, so roughly from 3,000 to or 2,500 to 5,000 troops. And we provide not only the training but equipment as well, particularly communications gear, and standardized command and control doctrine to enable units from different countries to work together effectively. This, of course, is always a problem, bringing contingents from different countries that have different training backgrounds, different types of equipment to form an effective fighting force on the ground. And as we've proceeded with the ACRI program, we've taken the position that the battalions that we've trained must be prepared to operate either singly or jointly under the command of civilian political mandate, which could be laid down by the UN, by the OAU, by a sub-regional organization, or by a coalition of the willing. As I've observed the African security scene over the past several years, several lessons have become increasingly clear to me. The near and the mid-term future for African security will increasingly rest with sub-regional organizations such as ECOWAS, SADC, and EAC. Over much of the African continent, states are banding together under the umbrella of institutions originally created to deal with economic development and political cooperation, and are modifying these institutions to take on security burdens. Bear in mind that because they were focused on political cooperation and economic development, they did not focus on security, and where they have dealt with security issues such as with ECOWAS, it's been done on an ad hoc basis. We see this, for instance, in ECOWAS, where they've played the role in Liberia and in Sierra Leone and Guinea-Bissau. On an ad hoc basis, they organized a peacekeeping operation. But there are also clear indications that SADC and the EAC will also be increasingly called upon to deal with security issues. Sub-regional actors have themselves come to this realization after concluding that the UN cannot deal with every conflict. Basically, when you dial 911, sometimes the phone is busy in New York. After noting that the OAU has taken a decision at the head of state level that they will not mount peacekeeping operations. Instead, they will turn to the United Nations to take on the responsibility of peacekeeping. And in this security environment, the sub-regional organizations are evolving as mid-level entities that possess a wider political authority than a single state and have greater freedom of action than either the OAU or the UN. At the same time, it's clear that the security architecture of the different sub-regional organizations is evolving at different speeds, with ECOWAS, that is in the western part of the west coast of Africa, being far out ahead of the others. But our effort within this training program is as much political and diplomatic as it is military, because while we train in the peacekeeping skills that are necessary to participate effectively in a peacekeeping operation or in a humanitarian relief operation, we also insist on the values of professional military and appreciation for the civilian side of peacekeeping, how the political mandate works, how to interact with civilian authorities, as well as with international organizations and NGOs. Bear in mind that NGOs are always on the ground before military arrive, and they're there after they leave. And how and why it's the peacekeeper's duty to protect civilians and respect human rights. To do this effectively, I've learned it's essential to integrate civilian authorities into the ACRI training. And we do this by inviting civilian representatives from the governments, from the NGOs, and from sub-regional organizations to participate. And I think we need to have more integration of representatives from sub-regional organizations involved, because after all, I think mandates for peacekeeping operations in the future we will see coming more and more from the sub-regional organizations, so that they also understand what must be the elements of a mandate, the rules of engagement that flow out of that mandate, and the role of of NGOs and others. The purpose, of course, here is to create what's called in the military a command and control, or C2 capacity. Because it's only by working together, developing common understandings, and getting to know each other on a personal level that the sub-regional actors and the militaries will be able to develop an effective capacity. One of the things we've learned from our own experience in the United States, and it certainly is applicable elsewhere, is that you can't take units that have not trained together and form an effective force. They must train together before they can perform effectively. One of the lessons I've also learned from on the diplomatic and political side is that obtaining consensus in Africa is a very time-consuming, a very time-intensive process, requiring a great deal of diligence and a great deal of patience. A conversation, for instance, with one of the sub-regional organizations must be carried on at 3 levels simultaneously. To push forward, for instance, the concept of cooperation between the program that I run and the sub-regional organizations, we have to speak directly with the authorities of the sub-regional organizations to explain the benefits of this cooperation, to deal also with the leaders of the member states, as well as representatives at the Organization of African Unity that are responsible for security and peacekeeping, because their blessing is always important in a political sense for the sub-regional organizations to participate. And you go and you talk, and then you find that you have to go back and talk more. Because there's simply no rushing of our African partners who are very sensitive to protocol and to consensus. And consensus in Africa is very important. It's also essential for all those involved to have a certain comfort level before moving forward. Another policy goal for the United States in Africa is accelerating Africa's full integration into the global economy. As I noted in my opening remarks, a visionary economic policy toward Africa is in our own long-term interests. Such a policy rests on 2 mutually supportive and intertwined foundations. First, our economy is increasingly fueled by exports in terms of jobs. As we grapple with the consequences of turmoil in our traditional and emerging markets from Asia and Latin America and Russia, the United States cannot afford to write off any potential market. A vast and growing region of over 700 million potential consumers, Africa is in many respects the last frontier for U.S. exporters and investors. In fact, about 2/3 of African states are in the process of implementing various reforms to open up their economies and to stabilize their currencies and to reduce inflation. This, of course, makes these countries much more attractive to potential U.S. investors. U.S. businesses now export on an annual basis about $6 billion worth of goods to Africa, while they import about $16 billion. Most of that, of course, is petroleum. The U.S. is now Africa's 2nd largest industrial supplier. The recent passage by Congress of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, it promises to further expand the two-way trade and investment links between African and American businesses and consumers by establishing protocols similar to those we have with other emerging markets. We also, I think, have to work in concert with Africans to combat what we refer to as the transnational threats, which come from Africa as they do from the rest of the world. These include terrorism. You recall that 2 American embassies were blown up in Africa in 1998, one in Nairobi and one in Dar es Salaam. And I will be in those countries, both of those places, next week. Weapons proliferation, narcotics flows. A great deal of narcotics are now flowing from Asia through Africa to the United States. There's also the specter of failed states, international crime, environmental degradation, and disease. And when we mention disease, of course, one of the first things that comes to mind is AIDS. And continued in close cooperation with Africans is important to our own mutual security, and this is an important priority for U.S. policymakers. Transnational security threats are most difficult to combat where national institutions are weakest, and this is probably the greatest weakness in Africa's institutions, where people are poorest and where conflicts are most enduring. Strong, democratic, economically productive societies are less likely to provide terrorist or drug traffickers with material support, safe havens, or a gullible following. In contrast, where democratic governance fails, poverty prevails, and strife is the norm. And we risk seeing whole countries, even regions, who are more vulnerable to these types of influences. I think we have made considerable progress along this path so far, but I think we still have a long way to go. We have provided modest amounts of anti-terrorism training in African countries, as well as information on activities of terrorist groups, but there's still a long way to go. We work with the law enforcement authorities from a number of countries to interdict illicit drugs before they hit U.S. streets, but clearly that's only a small part of the total traffic. What we need actually is to craft and fund and implement a continent-wide counter-narcotics strategy. We have urged concerted international action, including sanctions and travel restrictions, to stem the flow of arms, ammunition, and explosives into African conflict zones, again with limited success. We've cleared thousands of acres of mines in Africa. There's still thousands of acres to be cleared of mines. We have also pushed the Safe Skies for Africa initiative, an effort to make airports safer so that when people travel to Africa, they can do so in greater security. And we are also in the area of health. Centers for Disease Control and other agencies work very closely to try to stem the problems of diseases like malaria and AIDS, which of course know no borders. But ultimately, of course, Africans themselves must determine if their dreams for a better future will become a reality. We cannot make that choice for them. But I hope that I have outlined here that it's in the interest of the United States to work in partnership with the Africans and our African partners there to help secure the continent's well-being, which is critical to securing our own. At this point, this is the end of my formal presentation, and I would like to open it up to questions at this point, if you have some, either about Africa, foreign policy, or the Foreign Service. Thank you. Sir. Yes, sir. That's a major issue right now. It's called coltan. It's a mixture of two different elements, and it's becoming a very, very hot product, as you mentioned, used in computers. As a matter of fact, I think 2 Christmases ago there was a crisis began to spike because of a shortage of this product. This is a product now which is almost competing with diamonds and gold in Congo. As you know, it's occupied by a number of different countries and different rebel groups, all of whom are exploiting the resources of those regions to finance their war effort and to enrich themselves. One of the complaints against Rwanda is that they're financing their war efforts and to finance their own government as well by the sale of coltan, which is basically, I understand, to be basically a black, sandy-looking product, but is so expensive that you can ship it out by air and still make a tremendous profit out of it. And there's a report, it's the subject of an extensive report by the United Nations that was published 2 to 3 weeks ago, having to do with the exploitation of resources in Congo, Zaire. And coltan figures very prominently in that. I believe the statistics say in this report that 80% of the world's coltan is located in Africa. 80% of Africa's resources are located in the Great Lakes area, primarily in Congo. That is part of the degradation when you have conflict and you have refugees. Both the military and the refugees look for food. They scavenge as they go along. And inevitably, the wildlife are the victims of that. Bear in mind that with the armies that are occupying the country, as well as the refugees that are there as well, there has been tremendous damage to the environment, and not just killing of animals, of course, which has a long-term problem, but it's just the cutting down of trees for firewood and for cooking. It has this tremendous impact on the environment. It's just one of the prices for the conflict. Sir. Zimbabwe, of course, is one of those big disappointments in Africa, in the sense that here was a country with great promise, with a considerable infrastructure, very educated population, strong tradition, democratic tradition. And when Mugabe came in, of course, he was seen as being, in a sense, the father of his country, and one had hoped at that point that Zimbabwe had overcome the problems of apartheid and could move forward to build a really pluralistic democratic society. But all those who are freedom fighters are not necessarily democratic. Mugabe, of course, from the very beginning is not. Mugabe, somewhat like Kabila, as a matter of fact, became frozen in time in terms of his thinking. He was somewhat of a Marxist in his thinking. He's never been able to overcome that. And he, at this point, I think in time, remaining in power is very important to him, even though he's 76 years old at this point. What is happening here is that with the concerted attack on institutions, on the judicial and on the legislative, one finds that there's a weakening of institutions. One finds that the atmosphere of repression is very evident in Harare and throughout the country, as a matter of fact. The land issue is a very sensitive issue. It's an issue where there must be some degree of justice involved here, and nevertheless it becomes the type of political football that can be kicked by someone like Mugabe for his own benefits. The economy is on a slow rot process that has been going on now for quite some time and will continue for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. Zimbabwe's involvement in Congo does not really adds and aggravates that particular problem. So I think for the near term, I think that Zimbabwe will continue along the current path, which unfortunately is downhill. Elections, of course, presidential elections are scheduled for year 2002. Mugabe at this point is consolidating his position within the party, the Coup party. Will he run for re-election? It appears that he will, and if it does, I think we'll see a further deterioration, which again is very unfortunate. But again, these things don't take place in isolation. There's an impact on the neighboring countries. There are refugees. As the economy declines, people try to leave to look for better prospects. It also means that in terms of being a market to other countries, that market is simply in decline. Yes, sir.
My name is Kurt Osterheide. My question is with regard to the geographical assignment of foreign service officers.
Yes, sir.
There's been some, I guess, criticism lately by some foreign service officers to what they view as a necessary form of lobbying to attain a certain location or assignment. What are your feelings about the process, and to what extent have you lobbied for, if you have, for any of the assignments that you've received?
Very interesting question here. And I can tell you that when I first came in the Foreign Service a few years ago, you basically sort of expressed your wishes, and then you were sort of assigned your assignment. But about 10 years ago, the personal system basically said, we're no longer your lawyers, we're simply your accountants. You do your income tax, you make the money, we'll file your tax return for you, so to speak. Yes, in the Foreign Service, you do have to find your own assignment, so to speak. Now, we go through this process every year. We're about to start the process again every summer, and in which personnel will put out lists of upcoming positions, both in terms of locality as well as the grade of the positions, because the Foreign Service, as you can imagine, is a very hierarchical system. So you look within this system what you're interested in, both in terms of locality, both in terms of your own grade, and in terms of subject matter. We have jobs that are primarily political, economic, administrative, consular, and what have you. And once you identify and put in a list somewhere between, I think it's 8 and 15, you have to lobby very intensively, because you can imagine that particularly for the choice assignments, you can have 75 people requesting that job, only one of whom will receive it. And so if you wish to have that assignment, you have to go and talk to the people who make that decision. Very often it's the principal deputy assistant secretary in any given bureau. You also lobby ambassadors who can help you get that assignment, and it's extremely important to do so. Now, on the one hand, that sounds a little strange perhaps, but on the other hand, it's like if you go out for a business, you basically have to go in, to lobby for a particular job and explain why you are the best person for that job. I think it has certain benefits to it, in the sense that it requires initiative on the part of Foreign Service officers, and it also requires you to compete, which I think always brings out more in people. I think the process works. I say that, of course, because I think it's worked for me. But I think it's also a fairly good system. Not everyone shares that to the same degree, but I think overall the system works fairly well. Yes, ma'am. I beg your pardon? You referred to the most recent one in which they took over the radio station? Because it could have happened overnight. In the case of Africa, if you ever heard the news in the last 30 minutes, you may be behind the curve. But if you're referring to the coup that occurred last week, I believe, in which there were, I think, about 40 soldiers who took over the radio and announced that they were launching a coup. That went nowhere. They gave up, and the coup did not take place. But bear in mind that was last week, and there's always the danger of a coup. one of the things you have to bear in mind in Africa, and it's interesting why it's important to have experience when you work there, so that you can put in mind in the proper context what a coup is. When I was in Brazzaville, as a matter of fact, we referred to the mutiny of the month, because when troops are not paid, they go out in the streets and start shooting. Occasionally someone might get killed, unfortunately. But if you know the country well, you can tell the difference between this is just a protest versus an effort to grab power. Now, I think one of the lessons that was learned from Côte d'Ivoire in December of 1999 is that the unthinkable can happen very easily in Africa. I was there in early December because we were doing training there at the time, and obviously the political situation was continuing to get, it was becoming more intensified and hotter. But in talking to my colleagues at the embassy and talking to authorities of Ivorian authorities, as well as the French who are very present there, a military coup was simply dismissed as impossible, in part because it never happened and there was no tradition of a coup in Côte d'Ivoire, and a very small military relative to the population and the police forces. Nevertheless, 3 weeks later, there was a coup. And I think the lesson from that is that coups cannot be excluded from almost any country. Clearly, in some places, they're more likely than in others. Burundi, in the political situation, remains a very fragile country, and coups may well be attempted in the future. Okay. Sir.
There's been some criticism for U.S. foreign aid in African countries, and in terms of what is granted and what is administered for voters, and this is especially so, I think, with the former Zaire. Do you want to comment about how you see that?
That's a question which is very much in the forefront of policy discussions, and I think it's a very pertinent and important one. The aid policies, if you study economics, economic development, I think, has been a work in progress, and I think very serious of advanced and over the years. And I think many experiences have been learned about giving aid in Africa. And one of those, of course, is that in giving money directly to governments, you may be contributing more to the corruption than to the building of institutions and other things. And I think some of those lessons have been learned over the past 40 years, particularly in Africa. And a greater effort, of course, to work with what are called non-governmental organizations. Now, that in itself has a side effect. What is the side effect? In Africa, the men tend to run the politics, but women oftentimes form NGOs. And since Western development organizations do not give money to individuals, they give it to NGOs. So if you want money, you establish an NGO, which may be constituted of yourself, perhaps your family, maybe a neighbor or so, and you apply for assistance along those lines. So you have a plethora of NGOs, most of which are not really viable. But I think some of the lessons learned is, first, it's better to work with the non-governmental organizations, the effective ones, that is, rather than with governments, although you have to work with the governments in some cases, but you don't give direct budgetary support. And also, I think there is focus on institutions, trying to build institutions. This, of course, remains the major weakness, I think, throughout Africa, because it's personalities, not institutions, that count, so that power is, by and large, monopoly of the president, and through the power of patronage, all people are tied to him. Institutions tend to be weak. I referred a little earlier to what's happening in Zimbabwe, where institutions were quite strong, such as the judiciary, and now you have the executive basically ignoring decisions of the Supreme Court, which again begins to weaken the respect for the Supreme Court. So I think institutions, and also trying to work with the Africans themselves to take on the responsibility for managing and running these projects in the longer term. Because there has to be a buy-in by the local authorities and by the local population. Otherwise, as soon as the foreigner who's been financing the project leaves, it generally collapses. So I think those are some of the primary lessons. Other questions either about Africa or about the Foreign Service? Sir.
In your position, who do you report to, or who is your as an ambassador, do you just know that?
In the hierarchical chain, as an ambassador, you report directly to the Assistant Secretary for your bureau. In my case, it's for Africa in this case. So I report directly to the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. They're the ones who do my performance report every year that we have to go through. They're also the ones who make the final decisions in terms of, or at least part of the process for determining assignments. Okay. Yes.
Kind of in relationship to what you were talking about before, what's your opinion of the actual importance and the actual role of NGOs and transnational organizations in Africa with regard to democracy, human rights, and some of the other security issues you mentioned?
I think NGOs are critical for the development of democracy. Because in the United States, we take for granted the fact that there's so many, what is referred to in Africa as civil society. But there's so many groups that are involved in the policy process. Whereas, unfortunately, in developing countries, oftentimes that's not the case. You'll find economic policy, for instance, policy on investment being made in total isolation from the business community. They read about the newspapers as you and I would. You'll have health policy without consulting with those in the medical profession. And I think one of the things that we can do is help to encourage and strengthen non-governmental organizations to participate in that policy process, to try to bring greater realism to the process, and also give them greater buy-in. And I think that's critical in the long run for the strength of good governance as well, to provide an oversight capacity as well. Okay. Sir. Yes, they have. As a matter of fact, almost all the countries that have been trained in the ACRI have been involved in peacekeeping activities of one type or another. The most recent UN peacekeeping operation, as a matter of fact, has just arrived 2 weeks ago in Congo, Zaire. And the Senegalese, who are part of ACRI program and have received training, are there. There are also military observers from Malawi that's participated in the program. But every single country in the program has been involved in one way or another in peacekeeping operations.
Are they trained by U.S. military personnel, or are we just supporting African military personnel?
I run the program at the State Department, but the actual training itself is done by Special Forces out of Fort Bragg, U.S. Army Special Forces. And we backfill with use of contractors, all of whom are retired military. For instance, the classroom discussion is generally done by as you prepare the scenario and certain skills, that is done by retired military. And then when it actually goes to the field operations, that is done by U.S. Special Forces. Yeah. Sure.
I just had a question. Most of your presentation was based on the assumptions of security, and you talked a lot about why the U.S. or how the U.S. has a lot of interest in Africa in terms of their national security. And it seems like that in promoting our interest in terms of national security, it seems like there would likely arise conflicts in terms of what African interests are and what United States interests are. I was just wondering if you could comment on how you as an ambassador would work to sort of fuse those and how you can, I guess, not get too caught up in ours in our interests in serving them.
Okay, you asked a question which has two sides to it. And let me answer the first part first. That is, how do you reconcile U.S. interests with those of Africa, if I understood correctly? This is, of course, always a negotiation process. And when you are talking to your African partners, you have to negotiate on that. And this can be a long and time-consuming process at times. African leaders generally don't graduate from with MBA degrees and doing Management 101. That's not the style. You have a decision, you make a decision, and you move on to the next thing. It's a long, slow process of consensus. And once you talk about it, you think about it, and even though it may be urgent, you come back and revisit tomorrow, and it's a different concept of time and calendar. And that's part of respecting the culture. But it's a negotiating process, whether it has to do with, for instance, opening up markets. You have to negotiate with the African partner as we will provide the following if you do the following. You sort of have to reach some sort of scale on that. Even in the training that I provide, for instance, I have to negotiate with the militaries of what we will provide and what we will not provide. Naturally, there's a tendency that they would like for me to provide far more than I can possibly afford to do so. I would like for them to provide some things that perhaps they're reluctant to do so. So there's always a negotiating process. Now, in terms of the U.S. ambassador, you are the American ambassador, and therefore you're there to promote U.S. interest. Now, having said that, you can sometimes best promote your interest by modifying your own demands. You get more by modifying your own demands. And you are to be there, the principal voice as to how those U.S. interests should be promoted. And you have to you have to use a certain sense of judgment as to how hard you push, how often you push to try to promote those interests. Okay. Sir. Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm offered too few. We do have, first of all, in terms of U.S. practices, we do have the anti-corruption practices, so that U.S. firms, and certainly in America, obviously cannot engage in corrupt practices in terms of dealing with the government. Now, I still have to get things cleared through customs, and so I have to work out that within the local context, and you have to be sensitive to that without getting involved in bribes. You can do that, because once you give a bribe, then it's like the fish that bites the hook. You are then hooked. And you give one bribe, you're open to paying other bribes. But you can get around that. Now, corruption is rampant first of all, it exists everywhere. It exists certainly in larger measure in Africa. Unfortunately, if you look at the list of most corrupt countries in the world, it tends to be, the African countries tend, as a matter of fact, to be on the more corrupt side of that, unfortunately. Nigeria and Cameroon have competed for the title of most corrupt, and they have some serious competition from other countries, but they have seesawed back and forth on that. It is, in my view, it is probably the most serious problem in Africa, in the sense that the resources do not go for building society, but rather are siphoned off for personal benefit and advantage. Now, because of the structure of societies and politics in many African countries, if you wish to make money, it's through the government. Whether you're in business or otherwise, if you don't have ties in government, you don't get the contracts, you don't get your goods duty-free through immigration service, you can't import because oftentimes there are monopolies in there, so forth and so on. And so wealth is tied to being part of the government. And those who become wealthy fast are those who are most senior in government very often. Now, there are obviously people of integrity who are in government, and there are honest cases. But unfortunately, in too many societies, it is a major problem. What it means is that the poverty in the country is not because of a lack of resources. And I think there's a great misunderstanding here. We oftentimes associate poverty with the absence of resources. Let me cite for you merely the case of Congo. I mentioned the supplies of coltan they have. But Congo is a country that seems to be blessed with everything, and in almost shameful quantities. And yet it's one of the poorest countries in the world, because the resources have been used to finance war and Mobutu's personal fortune and so forth. It does remain a major problem. Now, it isn't just a question, however, of material and money. It has an impact on the morals as well. It is not just at the senior levels, it is throughout society. And if you live in these countries and you go to the post office and you receive a package and you have any hope whatsoever of getting it, you may have to bribe 1, 2, or 3 postal clerks to get it. It's not about just to hand it to you because he or she's paid for that. And obviously there are exceptions, but this is too widespread. But it's like anything else. When you have the corruption, there is the impact on the moral fiber of society, so that corruption becomes the way of doing business. This is nowhere more evident, let's say, than in Congo. Now, this is much less, let's say, in a case like Senegal, but it exists in various degrees. Sir. You're from Congo, Zaire? What can you learn here in America to help you go back in terms of... That's a very interesting question. That's a very interesting question. And I think there are several, I would say two broad categories. One is always sort of on the technical side. I mean, this can be engineering skills, this can be accounting skills, this can be medicine or whatever else. And that's important. But I would say that's only part of the story. The other part of the story has to do with values and the way things are done. Now, this becomes a problem. Because if you get an MBA degree here, and you go back to Congo, and you walk into a government office, and you want to do things the way they're done here in, Management 101, you'll find that your supervisor will not be happy with you, because there's a traditional way of doing things, and it's not Management 101 at your university, or Wheaton or school or elsewhere. And that becomes a little bit of a problem, but I think it is the young people like yourself who can go back and who can help to start to change that process. Eventually, you can reach a position of real authority and have an impact on how business is done, so that corruption does not have to be done, so there can be greater transparency in the way decisions are made and the way finances are spent. So I would say it's those practices, business practices, government practices, that are really the key to changing the way things are done. Okay. Other questions? Yes. A lot of things are being done. Unfortunately, a lot of those efforts have been undone or impeded by conflict. For instance, the two Congos and Cameroon share the second largest tropical rainforest in the world. Lots of efforts have been made to try to protect that environment. World Wildlife Fund and others are involved in that. USAID has given an enormous amount of money for that. Unfortunately, due to conflict, some of that work is undone. Poaching of elephants remains a major problem. And often the eastern part of Congo, of course, and Rwanda with the mountain gorillas that you probably heard a great deal about, that have often fallen victim either to poachers, to soldiers, or to hungry refugees. A lot of that work has been undone, but there are many organizations that do try to address the question of that in terms of environmental degradation. But of course, as long as people are hungry and unemployed, it's very difficult to say the elephants are more important than you are. And that becomes there's a real tension there between the protection of wildlife and the needs of the population. Yes, please.
What, if anything, should the United States be doing about AIDS in Africa? What are they?
The United States is doing a great deal about AIDS in Africa, or trying to address the issue. Clearly, AIDS is a major, major problem. And the Center for Diseases Control is very active in trying to address that question. There are many other government agencies that are involved as well, many NGOs. But just to cite an example, in the program that I run, in every single training event, we include a module having to do with AIDS. AIDS, of course, is a broader social problem. It particularly affects military. Military tend to be young men who move around and have perhaps more money than the average might be. Therefore, it has an impact on military effectiveness. But it also has an impact in terms of the peacekeeping process, because if you take infected troops into an area, to a population that you're supposed to be protecting, and you spread the virus, then clearly you've undone a lot of the work that you wanted to do. On the other hand, if you send troops into a population that is infected, and they bring that virus back to their home population, then you have created a problem for your own self. So it's being addressed at many different levels. A lot of research is being done. A lot of people are being trained. And there are actually some encouraging signs in Uganda where they have been able to stem the increase in the rate of infection of AIDS, which I think is encouraging for the rest of Africa. Oftentimes, the rates of infection tend to be highest in southern Africa. And do you know why? Simply because you have roads in southern Africa that you don't have very often in central parts of Africa. For instance, in Congo, that you and I know so well, you don't have very much truck traffic because the roads have deteriorated to such a point that you can't. Whereas in southern Africa, the roads are quite good, and this has led to a tremendous spread of AIDS. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity of meeting with you, and I appreciate your questions. Well, they
cross-section of kids, you never know for sure.
So they have clearly have been following that.
Yeah, sure. But this group will be a little bit more akin to world affairs anyways. And that's who they are.
Let me say hello to this Congolese guy here. If I can catch him.
Go ahead.